So I want to do three things today in this presentation. I'm going to talk really about my position as a designer, which is really what I've done. It's what I've trained to do. I've practiced as in the field of industrial design for about 30 years. I also want to talk a little bit about why I think our sort of view of design has changed over that period of time, and why have we got to where we are in what we think design is. And then really to talk about a new approach and where I think we could be going. So my background, as I say, I've worked as a designer, received a number of awards for work. I started this business Next Design in 1992. And I've worked across a huge range of sectors. Been very fortunate in that part of my professional career to be involved with a lot of very different, very diverse kind of companies. This is going right back. This is one of the very first things I actually got involved with, creating an insulated coffee carafe. Ironically, it was one of the things that I did first design, and they're still making it 25 years later. So that was a pretty good start from that point of view. And we have something called Design Museum in London, and they were invited to collect and curate objects. And they get other designers to choose what's going to be there, and this has been chosen, is in the collection. It's in MoMA. I say, quite an astounding start. A lot of the kind of things that I've been involved in are what I might call exploratory studies. So this project was for Apple computers back in 1994. I've also worked as a consultant for companies like Nokia, Ferrari, got very involved in luxury goods. I was a retained consultant for London Transport, who run all of the transport systems for London for 10 years, and worked on a whole range of stuff from small-scale things, sort of signage systems and litter bins, to future study documents. And those kind of things are very interesting in terms of thinking. They're very sort of broad scoping documents, and often give you a chance to really bring together a whole bunch of different ideas. This is part of the collection that received a D&AD award. I mentioned luxury goods. I've worked for a lot of different companies in that field. But this one was quite interesting because it was a company called Connolly, and they are very traditional, going back to sort of 1850s, leather tanners and curriers. That's what they made, was hides. And they decided to try and diversify into the business of being a luxury brand. And so doing this project with them was not just about sourcing and designing all these bits and working with suppliers to get stuff together and orchestrating that, but it was also trying to paint a picture of what this company could be, what was their place in the industry that they were going to be in. Many of the brands are very well established, so Louis Vuitton kind of put their package around the idea of luxury travel and steamer trunks and things like that, and Hermes is very sort of equestrian. It's all about saddlery. Curiously, nobody had the car, and so this was really the starting point, was thinking about these beautiful cars with beautiful flowing lines on the bodywork and little metal details, and that's what you see coming out in the design there. This is a design for a course. So at Bath Spa, I was interested in the fact that we had design courses. So we had ceramics courses. What we didn't have was some sort of hybrid between designing stuff for manufacture and craft, and I thought that was an interesting gap. And so I shaped this course which brought together craft practice and design process. There's a place to experiment with new kinds of manufacturing techniques, rapid prototyping and CNC manufacturing, which are becoming cheaper and cheaper. And I thought, well, what happens if we start to treat those things as a craft process? We can actually batch produce objects. And so the students on this course are very experimental. They go across a whole bunch of different media, and they play around with these three core ideas. Three starting points: thinking about ideas, starting with experimenting with materials, or looking at objects. In a world where we make so much stuff, the objects themselves sometimes can become a raw material. How do we reuse those? How do we reinterpret them? So this is just an example of some of the work that the students were getting up to on that course. I don't run the course. I just had the fun of designing it. Somebody else does that bit. My role at Bath Spa is bringing this idea of design and design process and design thinking into creating environments for teaching and learning. I think they thought when they employed us in the university that we'd deal with the VLE system and just distance learning and stuff like that. I don't think they quite thought I was going to come and design this, which is a 7.5 meter high video wall. But again, what I wanted to do was to create a different kind of space for learning and teaching. And we've got a lot of music and performing arts courses at Bath Spa. And they do a lot of rehearsal stuff, and then they go and perform it. And we've got performance theatres there that they can work in. And I thought, well, we've got these two kinds of spaces, kind of finished performance, and then we've got classroom. But we haven't got anything really in between. And if we think about kind of hackathons and stuff like that, and how much people get out of learning in a collaborative environment or in a semi-public space. And so this is actually part of the new building at Commons. The atrium space is wired up so we can have inputs and outputs and sound things and trigger stuff. And we can do all kinds of stuff on this screen. We've got a really interesting program lined up for the next year for this. This was just at the opening of the building where we had Lord Putnam, David Putnam, the film director, opened the building. And I took some pictures. Yeah, he was really complimentary about what we were trying to do. And it's trying to sort of break the thinking. The format of the wall is about how do we reinterpret that. It's clearly not a TV space. It's not about broadcast media. And it just kind of gets you to recalibrate your brain and think, well, if it isn't for that, what could I use it for? So hopefully that's established I am a designer. Good. What does that mean? What does that mean? I mean, we sort of think of designer as being a kind of, unfortunately now, I think it's a label. It just sort of means new and cool. Designer stuff. But actually the word design is very old. The root of the word lies in Latin. And it comes from the Latin designatus, which means designated. The past participle of that is designare, designare. So de means out, and signare is to mark. So in fact, design is about marking out. If we go back to the real origins of that word, back to the Latin, it's not about sketchbooks or cool jeans. It's about something much bigger than that. And yet, if I ask you, what does a designer look like? That's it, really, isn't it? You know. So how do we get there? How do we go from that amazing word, design, with all of that, all those ideas that it could represent? How do we end up with some kind of dude in a T-shirt with an Apple logo? Maybe some of that is down to sort of where we are. We think about design, it's a very refined sort of thing. I mean, if I ask you to name a designer, you know, okay, he's a designer. He's even got the designer stubble in the T-shirt and the whole thing. And actually, when you talk about good design, people tend to use Apple as a bit of a benchmark for that. Yeah, it comes up in sort of mood boards. If somebody says, I want it to look a bit like Apple. And it's somehow that he's kind of encapsulated something which is quite refined or quite aspirant. So, you know, it's good, but it seems limiting somehow, I think. And in fact, although Johnny Ive is clearly a very well-known designer, the design goes further back than that. And in fact, this guy is really more the father of design. So in the 1930s, Raymond Loewy was known as the man who shaped America and the father of industrial design. He was featured on the cover of Time magazine. And if I just run through and just list some of the stuff that he did, you know, it was cold spot refrigerators, Coca-Cola vending machines, the railroad locomotives for Pennsylvania Railroad, Studebaker cars, Shell, Exxon, Lucky Strike, the TWA Greyhound Senior Cruiser bus, the Air Force One livery. I could just go on. I mean, how did he do all of that? What kind of training did he have? He was a window dresser in Macy's. So he didn't have a design training. He was an illustrator, did fashion illustrations, but he started out as a window dresser. And although he did visualize a huge amount of product, as I say, just Google Raymond Loewy, you'll just see. I mean, the business still is alive today. You know, it's an amazing business. What he didn't do was create that notion of branding and sort of market segmentation. That came even earlier. That came from Alfred P. Sloan. And if you don't know, Alfred P. Sloan was the chairman of General Motors Company. And he did a whole bunch of really interesting things. He was known for this particular catchphrase here, a car for every purse and purpose. And he proposed that in 1924 in his annual report to GM shareholders. And he did a lot of other interesting things to the business. He restructured it so that the operations was decentralized and administration was centralized. So there was a kind of idea of creating greater efficiencies through bringing together the things that could be brought together, but also pushing apart the things that ought to be different. So was he a designer? Not really. He was an electrical engineer, technically, by training. But he wasn't really again, he wasn't a designer. But in some ways he was designing and shaping businesses. Another word that gets used a lot is engineer, and I put up. I know I'm English, I have to put him up, don't I? I have to, Brunel. And what do we know Brunel for? Great Western Railway. In fact, the Great Western Railway, he not only did the railway, but he did tunnels, viaducts, bridges, the stations, SS Great Britain. So we think, you know, huge engineering feats. But in fact, what sometimes gets missed out is this bit. The reason he built those things was he had a vision, and his vision was that you could go into Paddington Station in London and buy a ticket. And that ticket was valid to New York. But there wasn't a railway that did it, and nobody had built a ship that did it. But that was his vision. And to me, that's much more than being an engineer. That's having a much. Engineering was a language, but it somehow went way, way wider than just being about engineering. And the other word that comes up a lot is inventor. And that's something that I think most people would say, what did Alexander Graham Bell do? They wouldn't say he designed the telephone, he invented the telephone, okay? But is that really any different? You know, how did he invent he invented other things. He actually invented the metal detector. He invented the hydrofoil boat. He also invented a system for recording on magnetic media. He couldn't quite get that one to work. But we did later on. And just think how phenomenally life-changing that was. And yet, he wasn't, you know, trained in any of those kind of things. In fact, his real passion was he specialized in studying the human voice, which was inspired when his father brought home an automata, which he attempted to recreate and make this thing actually speak. Very mechanical thing. So, how does all of that happen? How do those people end up where they are? What kind of things might be in place? It's easy to think, in one sense, you think, well, yeah, that's easy, because all the easy stuff's been done. I mean, I could have invented the telephone. I mean, that's straightforward, isn't it? It's all the difficult stuff we've got left with. But really, the kind of things that they were making was the difficult stuff. Nobody had really thought about the idea of a completely integrated transport system. Nobody had thought about the idea of speaking over wires. These were genuine innovations. They all represented a really big shift in thinking. Now, I don't know if anyone's familiar with this book. If not, I would suggest a read. So Jared Diamond is professor of geography at UCLA, and he wrote this book in '97, so not an especially new book. And the question that he was asking was why Eurasian people came to displace Native Americans, Australians, Africans. How did that happen? Was it because Eurasians are smarter? Maybe, maybe not. Were there other conditions at play? And he proposed that there were. And it was things like biodiversity that encouraged farming. It was the fact that Eurasia is an east-west continent and ideas could spread. Really what he was talking about were preconditions. He suggested that preconditions enabled those kind of things to happen. And when we look back at the people I've just talked through, what we'll find is that there were some interesting preconditions. There were things around at the time that perhaps these people were looking at that could help them to think differently. So they were in the right place. They did have some skills, but they were the right time. And I think more than anything else, they understood something about people, what people wanted, people's aspirations. It's no good inventing things if you don't get that sort of buy-in. So the telephone was real-time voice communication. But the time that it came in was really coming in on the tail end of the development of the American railroads. And alongside all the railroads were the telegraph wires. And they were put in there because telegraph was the means of communication. And that was how they could coordinate the deliveries of materials, how they managed to build the railway. I mean, that was a massive exercise requiring a lot of material to be in the right place at the right time. And telegraph was the means of communication. But it just occurred to me, really, that the telephone obviously relied on wires, and it's essentially enhanced a network that was already there. But it was a fundamental shift. It enabled you to have real-time voice communication with somebody at a distance. And that hadn't been done before. Similarly, those ambitions of Brunel came in really at the end of the Industrial Revolution, which was just an amazing time. That was where steam had gone from being leaky, kind of puffy sort of engines that weren't really much use for anything, into real industrial powerhouses, things that could power bellows, that could drive iron-making foundries. So it was enabling the production of iron in much greater volumes. That enabled machine tools. We had textile manufacturing, and we had export markets. So all those conditions were there. And the idea of building on the back of that to say, well, hey, wouldn't it be great if we could actually create passenger traffic, if we could sell tickets for people to travel across the world? That's an idea that anyone would buy into. And what's interesting about Sloan and GM is that that statement that he made to the shareholders was made coming right into the middle of the Depression. That was when so many companies were just failing. And what was different perhaps about GM and Ford was very engineering. So he built a car and he wanted to build a better car and a better car. But it was always about the better car. Whereas what Sloan did was change the structure of GM, diversified the manufacturing, centralized the administration, made it more efficient, created brand and market segmentation, which meant, back to his every person purpose, widened the market for the cars. And despite those hideous trading conditions, GM stayed in the black throughout that period. which I just think is amazing.
Just the opposite of what happened later.
Very true. The opposite of what happened later. You're quite right. With Lowy here, he had this relationship with Studebaker. And that was very interesting because in the Second World War, the big three were basically turned over to focusing on war work. They were actually banned from making passenger cars or from planning to make passenger cars. But Studebaker had Lowy as their consultant, and they got round that loophole, so they could actually pay him. He developed the car, and they came out with this 2 years ahead of anyone else.
T-bird.
It's not a T-bird, no.
No, but
It looks a bit like a T-bird, probably because people like Ford were looking at something like this. So yeah, I mean, this came out. I mean, imagine that. You've just been through the war, how people must have been feeling, and this car comes out. The lines, the fins, you know, that was his first, you know, Lowy was very, you know, streamlining. He was also known as Mr. Streamlining. But as all of those lines are in there, the wraparound glass at the back, you know, it was just, again, that sort of situation that he happened to be in that was allowing him to push those ideas a lot further. And funnily enough, when you start looking at the details, the same thing works for this. 1998, when this was launched, the marketing campaign around it, you may know, there is no step 3 was the catchphrase. You plugged it into power, you plugged it into the telephone socket, and you turned it on and you were connected. But what's different is the other things that were going on around that. So prior to that, you had analog modems, which were a bit flaky and a bit squeaky, and you didn't always get really clean connections. So they weren't as reliable as a digital modem. And in 1998, that's when the V90 standard, which was the first kind of cohesive standard for digital modems, came in. And that's what this had. So this had good, solid digital connectivity out of the box. And other things happening. Google filed for incorporation as a company in 98. That was also the year that AOL bought CompuServe, who previously had been the biggest provider of this kind of one-stop walled garden approach to the internet. And they also bought Netscape, which were the makers of Netscape Navigator, the open source browser. So there's all of these things happening. And you come out with a product that just gels a whole bunch of those things together. So it's really about a human-centered approach, an approach to problem solving. And that's something that we would call design thinking. Okay? It's looking at design as a process that can enable a different kind of thinking, a different way of envisaging the world around us. And it needs not just a technical skill, but it needs empathy. You have to empathize with your potential customer. You have to understand how somebody might feel in order to understand how you might want them to feel. You have to be open for experimentation and prototyping. And I mean prototyping in the broadest sense. You can prototype an experience. You can prototype. You can try stuff out. You can observe what happens when you put these prototypes, when you try to envisage how something might work, looking at how people respond to that. That will lead to failure, but you've got to fail, and you've got to fail forward. You've got to learn from that. So you've got to be optimistic. You've got to try again, iteration. You've got to be open to collaboration. And you've got to have that kind of integrative thinking. You've got to have something that allows you to step back and see the bigger picture and understand a little more about the kind of holistic place in which your ideas live. Tim Brown of IDEO, so I know Tim from college days, and he was the proponent of this sort of design thinking idea. And he proposes that we need 21st century careers, 21st century skills, and this idea of design as being about the cool goods, about the next new thing, is really not where we should be at. And we should be looking about how other kinds of skills, entrepreneurial skills, research skills, business skills, social skills, And how do we match those up with the process of design, with design thinking, to help us to envisage a new way of looking at things? As I said, design is to mark out, and that doesn't mean about sketching. It can be about envisaging a territory for a business or an application or a service or any of those things. And as we've seen from the people I've talked about, your skills don't have to be design skills. The people we've looked at have had skills in a hugely diverse range of areas, and yet they've made really significant changes. So I started out asking if you were a designer, but I think we all make decisions about our world. Everything you see around us, everything in this room was designed. Everything you can't see in this room was designed. From the systems, the services, the financial structures, the payment systems. We live in a completely designed world, and it's not purely about objects. And to help make the right decisions, I think design is a process that we could use, and we could use that to find out what kind of designer we could be. Thank you.